Welcome to Full PreFrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome back to Full PreFrontal, Exposing the Mysteries of Executive Function. I'm your host, Sucheta Kamath, and I cannot believe this milestone is upon us, or mainly here for me, but we are celebrating a 200th episode. And to mix it up, I have these two amazing guests who I claim as mine. They're my children, and who have graciously offered their time and generous participation. And I cannot wait to see how it unfolds. So with me, I have Kunal Kamath. He is an engagement manager at McKinsey and Company. In his spare time, he loves the performance arts, crossword puzzles, and cultivating indoor jungle with the houseplants in his Brooklyn apartment. And Rahil is my younger one. He is studying to earn his doctorate in clinical psychology at Rutgers University. He loves reading novels. He's an avid soccer fan and, much like his mom, enjoys nerding out on all things psychology and cognitive neuroscience. I'm going to add that, Rahil. So welcome to the podcast. And I'm so honored to have you both, and very excited because I don't think we have done this before or have taken a deep dive in the conversation about the podcast itself. So thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having us. It's such an honor. 200 episodes. I feel like I wanted to use one of those air horn sirens to commemorate when you said that earlier. But yeah, really, really happy to be here.
Yeah, and just to add to what Kunal had been saying, it's amazing to be here and see it from the inside, what it's looked like to do this podcast. I was kind of expecting, as soon as I joined, to hear that music and the woman's voice introduced the podcast, but I realized that doesn't happen until after the production. So it's awesome seeing you in your element, Mom, and being here as a featured guest. And to that point, Kunal and I were doing some talking. We thought it could be really cool to flip the script a little bit, switch it around. And you've been such a great interviewer to 199 previous guests. Why not have us be the interviewers for you for this 200th episode? So we came prepared with some questions. And I don't know, Kunal, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, let's do it. We'd just love to hear about kind of the journey of making this podcast through your voice, your words, for this commemorative 200th episode. And, we of course know this, but your listeners may not, right? Having this podcast is far from your full-time job. You're someone who juggles so much. You run your own company, you raise us as children, you're very involved in local politics and your community. And I'm just, curious, how do you see Full PreFrontal, this podcast, fitting into that tapestry of all the things that you do, right? How does it nourish and sustain you and, allow you to keep at it, right? Even when there's so much else going on in your life?
What a great question, and so thoughtful of both of you to kind of be so meta and peek behind the curtain. And it just got me thinking that first of all, I was involved since 2015 or 16. I've been involved in something called Interfaith Speakers Network, and I've been collaborating with people of multiple faiths, representing Hinduism, talking in many spaces. And one such friend I met, who is a Buddhist friend, who also in his day job is runs a business, and he introduced me to somebody who had a podcast. So this friend of mine had a podcast, and he said, "Would you be a guest on my podcast? Because we have an overlap interest of spirituality and business." And so I went to the studio, which is off of Glenridge, and it used to be my old office. Very interesting, but anyway, full circle. I sat in the studio with this amazing guy who was a producer, and as soon as that interview got done, I said, "Podcast? What about me doing a podcast?" And So that was the seed of that thought. But I want to kind of rewind the time machine here for a second. And for, in my career, attending a lot of continuing education or developing my mind by really seeing a very broad picture of, the business of changing people. Rahil, you're in this going to be in this field of psychology. I'm in cognitive neuroscience, cognitive rehabilitation. And one thing that I became very quickly aware that all the knowledge is not housed in one domain. And so for 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I started attending conferences that were not in my field. So I would go to see, social psychology and personality conference and not know a single person. But I was so interested in they used to do like parallel strands about self. So they used to, researchers who study the knowledge of self would have like a pre-conference workshop for a whole day. And they would talk about self having multiple identities. Now, mind you, I have had zero training in psychology, so I wouldn't even understand, but I was so interested in that. Then I would go to cognitive neuroscience, where people would, cognitive neuroscientists who study brain cells and activation and things. And I would go and attend those conferences and understand that all the networks go through prefrontal cortex. So I was beginning to get piecemeal information about the way the brain networks information and how it influences behavior, thinking, mindsets. I also started attending conferences called contemplative studies. So contemplative studies is neuroscientists who are studying impact of mindfulness and meditation on changing attention. Now, remember, if you came from my field and you were used to working with broken brains, and I say broken brains in the sense neuropsychological impairment, you always thought that attention can be improved with focus training. You never thought by focusing on your breath you could improve attention. Like that was considered voodoo, right? And again, remember, this was 15 years ago. And now we are living in breathing space of mindfulness having tremendous impact on not just cognition, but wellness. So anyway, long story short, one of the nerdiness that I have is when I go to a conference, I always sit in the first 2 rows. I always take notes, and I always go and say hello to the speaker, because I am just so mesmerized by the way they approach their work that over the years I have known people. I've gotten to know people. So like Russell Berkeley, and I went and argued with him that his belief was you have to train ADHD in the point of contact. And I went and argued with him how it's not possible. And then he says, "Who are you now?" So I kind of told him like who I am. So what happened along the way over last 10 to 15 years, I had gathered a deck of cards on all the people I had no reason to ever meet them or talk to them again. And so when this idea occurred to me after being a participant in the podcast, I said, I can do this. And I said, I'm going to ask these people a question. And I reached out to world famous researchers and thought leaders. And one such a person I will mention who actually was at a TED event. And he is the world's renowned primatologist. And I happened to be in the audience in his a month before my podcast I launched. And I said, would you come on the podcast? And I had again gone and said hello to him. He agreed. So anyway, what I'm saying is it's a combination of really great enthusiasm, lot of long-term effort in understanding complex matters, and lastly, making connections with people. So there you have it. And I'll say one more thing about that. So in my, I always have a notebook with me. And in my notebooks, I used to have a section. So any conference I went, I would write the date, name of a person, name of a session, and then gibberish, like whatever they're saying. I think my way of processing information would write down things that I thought important. But in the back, I would always have a section, things to look up and things to transform. So my idea was, how would this apply to my work? So I had a section, how would this improve therapy? Because all 10, 15 years that I went to a conference, I always would say, great in theory, does it work? What's the point? Like, I would be in a session where a person has never worked with a patient with brain injury, but they're talking about the brain. And I would always say, this doesn't work. Right. So I had this like things to look up so I can enrich my mind. But I also said, how does this become a therapeutic process that influences my work? So this idea and discipline and also organization of thought has been crucial to really translating this work into something meaningful to people. At least that's been my vision.
Yeah, I love that. And I will say, like, as an aspiring, clinician myself, like I'm in my first year of a graduate program to become a clinical psychologist. I've learned things from your podcast that I've been able to apply in real life. Like one thing that even comes to mind recently was listening to an episode on self-compassion. I think it was Dr. Christine Neff, maybe.
Yes, Kristen Neff, yeah.
Kristen Neff, excuse me. And just those kind of words of wisdom of how to be compassionate to yourself and how that can expand into compassion for others, which really starts within. I think that's something that I've taken to heart as a therapist. And I feel like I love your focus on not just nerding out on the research, but trying to bring on people who can help you talk about like what will help us be better practitioners, better humans, better executive functioners. I think that's so cool. And I think that actually makes me think of like what I was thinking next is, Kunal had asked kind of like about your original hopes, how you felt like full prefrontal could fit into your tapestry of your career. And I'm wondering how you see it blossoming over the past few years. You've come so far, the kind of like the network that you feel like you want to start with the cards, you've gone all the way to the end. What's it been like to see it transform into what it is now? And was that what you expected? Did it totally change what you thought was possible? Yeah.
Such a great question. And wow. So honestly, my, when I started my journey, I had a very specific goal of explaining to people executive function is a lot more than organization. People often say, yeah, I'm not organized or I don't manage my time well. And that's it. That's how people understand executive function. And that's such a disservice to the complexity of the role executive function plays in one's lifetime life outcomes. But secondly, I think it's a story comes to mind. When I was a child, I grew up with this folklore called Seven Blind Men and an Elephant. It was a story of just for practicality, these seven men had a blindfold and they come to the palace and the king has a new beautiful creature called elephant, and they all are very, very curious to understand what the elephant is. And so they come to a courtyard and they are asked to sit, and they hear that the elephant is right around. So they all gather around this thing called elephant, and one touches the tail and says, "Ooh, elephant is like a snake." And the other one says, "No, no, 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 no." Touches the leg and says, "The elephant is like a pillar." And the other one says, "No, no, what are you talking about?" He touches the ear and said, "The elephant is a fan." So all this is going on and a mayhem downstairs, and the prince is upstairs, and he watches the plight of these seven blind men, and he asks his Sena or his courtmen to blow create heavy winds, and then the blindfolds are opened up, and then all the seven men see the elephant is all of it, not one thing. And so this story is so dominates my mind a lot when we think about executive function. That executive function is about focus. Is it about working memory? Is it about problem solving? Is it about, and it is so much more. And so people come to it by being blind with their blindfolds. And my hope is that prefrontal will be their foundational resource where they can gather information. But I will say, if you see those who kind of OG, who started with my podcast very earlier, I used to have the interview divided into two parts and publish two episodes. So I used to talk about what is it and how can we help. As time has gone by, I have changed the format and I do all of that consolidated into one section. But But what I also started doing is I feel like as I am the interpreter of maladies, I like to call. So that means I'm mostly like a patient advocate. So the doctor comes and a patient comes, and I can actually translate the language between each other. So I take the researchers and people who are experts, but they may have expertise in one aspect of it. But as a clinician, I know the lifelong big picture and where the pressure points are. So in that way, I have changed my format. The second thing I would say I have changed is I used to be very, very specific with people who use the term executive function, because then I'm like, okay, I am talking to experts who know executive function is the area of expertise that they need to. But now, since then, I have really veered into psychology, social cognition, social psychology, anthropology. I have business experts. I have Daniel Pink, for example. So the reason to do that is there's something called wisdom, and wisdom is what is universal language that is applicable to personal change. And the last thing I will say, my hope is um, in my in my podcast series, I have two additional components. One is called Big Picture, where I am the only speaker who's summarizing some ideas and giving practical tips to people, to listeners. And then the second is called X Files, so executive function. X Files. So Files was with clients that I have had, my own clients who were open and willing. So I've had episodes with clients and their firsthand experience. So in that way, I've created a smorgasbord of opportunities for people to learn, grow, and pick and choose what they think will add value to them. But I'm also challenging people to not be so limited in thinking that all I need to know about executive function is this and nothing else. So that's why the seven blind men analogy.
I love that anecdote, Mom, about the elephant and the blind men. I mean, I feel that you are the queen in the castle who's blowing the wind and, unburdening these men of their blindness. And the elephant is executive function, and the tail is anthropology, the leg is business, the trunk is psychology, right? There are so many things in our world, in our life, that executive function, is and kind of takes form in. And what I want to hear, what I'm curious about is your life, right? How have you seen executive function shaping your own personal life and journey? And, for example, one way it has shaped mine, although it's very hard to pinpoint this because it does feel like so interwoven into my, my everyday, my everyday organizational skills and everything, right? But I feel like, my kind of ability to problem solve is aided in great part by executive function, and not just the problems for work or for when other people come to me with things to solve, right? It's problems for myself, right? The kind of hardest problems to solve that executive function has given me the toolkit, right? To self-interrogate, to really understand why are those challenging for you, right? So for example, I'm a terrible procrastinator. I'll save everything to the last minute. I think I'll do a fine job, but I still don't want to procrastinate nearly as much as I do today. And, I think executive function has given me the toolkit to test, learn, figure out, right, why am I such a bad procrastinator, and what are some strategies, right, that would work for me, may not work for you, Rahil, may not work for you, Mom, but what works for me. And I think that actually, I won't go into the minutia of it, but right, that is actually executive function at work. And I think I'm so grateful that I think, Mom, you have inculcated that in us. So I'm curious, Rahil, I mean, maybe actually before we ask Mom, do you have kind of, a flavor for how executive function has mattered to you, or, made you who you are, and made you tick?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mom's going to eat this one up because I love her, I know it's not her concept, but the one that she preaches a lot is the future self. And it's just so accurate for how I think about life. I'm like such a delayed gratification person. I'm such a, think myself tomorrow kind of guy. And it comes out in big and small ways. Like, I think the most funny example in a small way is like, ever since I was a kid, and I don't know how this started, but I'm sure it has to do with Mom, as I always laid out my clothes for the next day, like the night before, to save myself like that extra like 5 minutes of having to make a decision in the morning when I'm tired. And honestly, I still do it, and it still pays off every day, and I'm so happy about it. It's something that my girlfriend likes to poke fun at me for, but I still think it's great. And I think like that plays out in big ways too. Like, I feel like I'm always taking a proactive approach to like planning out my education or my career path, or thinking about like, 1, 2, 3 years from now, is my future self going to thank my current self? And that really guides me in a lot of ways. And so I have to say I'm really grateful for that way of thinking, because it just makes me feel so much more equipped to deal with the difficulties of life. So that one's for you, Mom.
Well, it just warms my heart to know that, first of all, look at, oh my God, this is the promise, listeners, that executive function skills are skills, not gifts. And it just makes me so proud and happy that not only you're using the language to describe a process, and you really are walking and talking proof of that processes are mastered through experience, exposure, practice, and expert feedback. And the way I think about executive function, foundationally, my favorite way to conceptualize executive function is goal-directed persistence. That means, how do you persist to achieve the goals that you have crafted, designed, and created for self, by self? One of the most beauties in this definition is motivation. That means you're likely to achieve the goals that you have designed for you by yourself. And it's really a tall order to ask children to do that, because children are not yet masters of their destiny, but they need help to know how to design good goals. And if you don't do that, then you're really you become achievers of tasks. You're doing things, but doing things is not goals. Goal directed persistence is like when you say, I want to get in touch with Elizabeth. Well, the job is not done until you are in touch with Elizabeth. You can say, I left her an email, send her an email, or I called her and left her a voicemail. That is not the goal. The goal is to actually get in touch with. And I see so much compromise in this area that people don't understand the simple definition of goal-directed persistence. But the second part of executive function, and you captured it so well, Kunal and Rahil, that there are barriers to persist in achieving goals. And I think those who study the barriers are going to do two things. They're going to redesign the goals, or they're going to redesign persistence. And so procrastination, by the way, researchers say, Kunal, procrastination is never about time management. It is about pain management. So we procrastinate because we do not want to endure the pain of having to do whatever it is that we are trying to do. And so I always like to investigate, if this is a goal, then why am I not persisting? And second, is this a real goal, or is it somebody else's goal? Because that is the reason I'm not persisting. So procrastination is simply a byproduct of that. And once I understand that framing, it is so helpful. And the second part of executive function, which is also kind of lost on people, is it's not just goal-directed persistence, but it is having emotional agility and working like an emotional ninja while persisting, because persistence requires effort, and effort is painful. And I think this is another a very lot of things that in my life have been shaped by my upbringing, my cultural context, and lack of resources. And I think just not having things was the reason you would actually not get to do things, right? I was telling this story to a friend the other day, that I went to college and I really had this concept that my parents are very rich, primarily because they bought things. Like what? They bought a dress on my birthday. I thought that's rich people do that. I did not realize that they saved money to bought that dress. So when I came, a friend of mine offered this opportunity and said, hey, we are going to Singapore. And they were very wealthy people. And they said, if you want to join us, we can take you with us on this trip. Mind you, I was like 18 and I was so excited, never been to a foreign country. And they said, we'll take care of you. You just have to buy the ticket. And do you have a passport? And I had no idea how you eat a passport or what goes into getting a passport. But I came home with a great lift in my feet, and I came and I plopped this question on my with my parents, and I said, hey, listen, I have an opportunity to go to Singapore. Buy me a ticket. And when I heard it is going to cost 3 months' salary for my dad to buy one ticket, I was like, what? We're poor? Anyways, this is a silly story, but what it told me that I thought persisting means really being doggedly going after a goal and removing all barriers. But in this case, it wasn't my persistence that really came into picture, it's the reality. So I think having reasonable expectations and adjusting your emotions, your attitude, your mindset, and not feel mea culpa or woe is me, but really having a maturity to say, wow, I did not know, and adjusting my expectations, adjusting my goals, adjusting my mission is really something I have learned along the way. And so combination of both. So persist until you arrive at a goal, and if it's unattainable, you readjust, you redefine, and never give up. And don't think small of you or the small of the goal. I did manage to get a passport. I did leave the country. I did do all that after I got a scholarship. But I really understood that day that I cannot achieve any goals of going anywhere if there is no support of money. So do you understand what I'm saying? So anyway, that's my example of how practically I live in that space.
Yeah, I love that. And I think like one thing that you show us every day is that goal-directed persistence. Like even to Kunal's like earlier question, like you do so many things and you work within the realm of reality. You set reasonable expectations for yourself, but you never stop persisting. And that to me is really admirable and something that I feel like I want to emulate in my own life. So I think like you have shown us, not through your words, but more so through your actions, how you live the executive function every day. So that has been really meaningful to me. I do think that Kunal and I were curious about some kind of other topics. If we could shift gears even just
Yes,
about
please.
like what the podcast has done for you in terms of your own learning. You're obviously came into it being executive function expert, but was there anything that you learned along the way in these 200 episodes? Any guests you spoke to, any book you read, any sort of new concept that changed the way you thought about things, changed your worldview, opened your eyes? You still think about it today by being like, wow, I'm so glad that I read that book or that guest came on my show. Anything that's like you want to share with the listeners?
So many to list. I will say one of the most seminal influence of David Lancy. He is an anthropologist, and he has written hundreds of publications and has written multiple books. And one of the most interesting things that in his podcast I learned about, and he's written a brilliant book called Anthropology of Childhood. And one of the things that I had, the concept of weird, which is a communities. So if you look at the psychological research, and Rahil, this is going to be very interesting for you as you go forth. And this is also my growth. I would say I was so focused on clients, patients, people in front of you. So I live here in Atlanta. So I'm thinking about a small community of like 100 families that I maybe get a chance over multiple years to serve, right? And that becomes my world. But if I don't think about equity or don't think about the context, then I will not even ask this question, who comes to see me? I'm in private practice, right? So only those people who can afford me. So one of the things in his research, he talks about psychological research studies 13% of world's population. What? That means we are drawing these enormous conclusions, tiny, enormous conclusions about psychological behaviors, habits, and ways to influence theories on practicality based on data that's observed. Majority of that data is between college-going kids on campuses where they range from age 19 to 23, right? And we're drawing conclusions. So in his particular research, he talks a little bit about agency of children, and what does it mean to what does it mean to make children independent? And one of the anthropological viewpoint, he says, in countries like countries of African continent, there are ceremonies where children at age 2 are required to hold a knife and develop knife skills. They consider that independence. Can you imagine a 2-year-old in America being asked to hold a knife and be considered as a skilled 2-year-old, right? By 6, you're fending for yourself. You're going and getting food. So I think this concept has really spoken to me, that so much is context driven and so much is affordability or access. So I really think we have in Western world removed the agency from children taking independent decisions, and we want them to become autonomous based on my rules. So I want you to be really, really good and smart and get good grades so that you can go to a college that I think will be good for you. And so that has been a very different framework for me that has influenced deeply in the way I think and the way I conceptualize independence.
That's amazing. I love that example personally because, it shows that it's a true microcosm of this full prefrontal podcast, right? You are an expert practitioner, yet you still have so much of your horizons to be broadened by the guests that you bring on, right? By kind of the multitude of experience and kind of exposure that these other experts can bring you, and that kind of weird, right? How small that is in the grand scheme of the world, right? Is just a great kind of illustration of that. I'm curious, as well about, you are an expert and you've had so many, amazing, academics, thought leaders, clinicians, the whole gamut, right? Has there been anyone on or any topic, right, that you've kind of been exposed to through this journey that has really surprised you or challenged you in, a conventional belief that you've held? That's kind of something I'm always curious about as, an expert like yourself, right? It's true kind of growth, right? In kind of something that has actually, changed your mind or surprised you. I'm curious if anything has come across your radar.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, again, there's so many episodes to list. I do think that one particular I had, Horacio Sanchez, who is a poverty expert. And in order to speak on this particular, in preparation, I always have a little story. So I kind of gathered a little story about a young woman who had incredible life disadvantages and painful life experiences early on, and how she rose above it, and she managed to go to a really, really important university. She managed to graduate from that summa cum laude, and then she wrote a book, and she now is inspiring people. So I was trying to frame in a very traditional way that if you have poverty, if you come from poverty, it's all about overcoming through resolve. So I was framing executive function in my own limited ways, that how can we get people to become more of resolve? And he paused me and he said, Sucheta, but what about 99% of people who could not lift themselves up? Are we going to fault them for it? Or are we going to say life's mission is to overcome poverty by self? And it just made me pause, because I was really so hung up on, just like majority of the world does, is we look at success stories and we really celebrate success stories, because any non-successful stories are boring, annoying, or difficult to digest, right? And so we are really saying that there is an individual effort that really matters. There's nothing called collective effort, or there's no moral responsibility that we all have towards the betterment of all. And so when we think about executive dysfunction, it's so easy to call people lazy and call them incompetent and underdeveloped and say, I tried, I gave you resources. But the real process of developing executive function proficiency is, because you're struggling, I will persist to help you. Not I gave you some opportunity and you didn't take up on it. Hence now, too bad, you have executive function problems. So anyway, that has also shaped my thought process a lot. By the way, that has led me to, I've done series of presentations in last 2 years, something called inverting the burden. This has been my framework of really thinking what responsibility I have in success of other people. And this, by the way, is also called a very complex executive function skill, which is called perspective taking and shifting your framework mentally and flexibly with agility. And I have said, so one of the things I used to say in my private practice, for example, before I created my software, and software, designing the software was my commitment to this perspective shift. But I used to say, well, I am available to provide help to all. Seek me if you want. So if you did not seek me, that's because you didn't want, is my assumption. Never suspected there are barriers that are integral to where my location is, what kind of charges I have, what kind of availability of my schedule for people who have 3 jobs, right? That was not my burden. That was their burden. So now when I say that when inverting the burden is who doesn't have access to me, is a burden on me, not on them. That is true commitment to equity. So,
yeah, to me, that only further speaks to your executive function skills. I love that you sort of snuck in that little, importance of perspective taking, because due to your own strength in shifting perspectives and looking for disconfirming evidence and challenging your own beliefs, you were able to, I think, and I've seen this personally, really, grow as a person of like how you think about equity, think about justice, thinking about providing services to those most in need and doing that on a really wide scale, which I think is a big, purpose and passion for EXQ as well. Like that's kind of what your whole company strives to do. So I think it's cool that you're able to use perspective taking as a way to make that happen, because it's also really easy to have a podcast where you bring on a bunch of guests, you say what's your piece, and then you call it a day, but you really allowed them to influence you, which is, I think, unique and speaks to you.
I was going to add one thing, that if you really have strong executive function, you begin to demonstrate elevation of self. And there was this morning I heard a podcast, and this was a journey evolution of human evolution. And he says, it's like, imagine watching a 1-hour movie, and the fully developed prefrontal cortex appears in last 30 seconds of the 1-hour movie. So I think it's such a new set of skills, but with that elevation, it is the backbone of moral development. It is the backbone of doing right when doing that right thing is hard to do. It is backbone of justice seeking, and it is backbone of relentlessness when justice is not achieved. It is the backbone of apology. It is the backbone of considering yourself less important, or less, a better way to say it, considering other people equally important to having a share of happiness. And so the 3 particular skills that really speak to me, that if you have strong executive function skills, you wouldn't be showing great focus and perspective memory and problem solving and critical thinking and self-control, but you will be showing moral behaviors, and they look something like this: patience, self-effaciveness, that means humility, and great joy in work that you do. That's described as pride. So you're proud of your contributions. You do things in absence of anybody watching and evaluating you. Like, it's like the way I clean my kitchen counter when I don't have guests. That's the kind of thing. The way I close my umbrella outside before I come into the office so it doesn't drip. That is the kind of little things that you pay attention to. That's how highly developed executive function skills look. This is when you don't try to impress anybody for the sake of impressing. It's you become it. And that's the beauty of becoming a better human being, so to speak.
I love that, because you're actually kind of teeing up a question that I had, which was, I'm not sure if it's tied to this kind of root part of executive function that, gives you that, true character of performing at your peak, even when no one's watching, or kind of doing it not for the sake of pride or your ego. I'm not sure if that is the motivating factor. I'm not sure if it is, your spirituality, which I know is a big part of who you are, and this is the motivating factor. I'm not sure if it's this concept of goal-directed persistence that we talked about earlier. But, a question that I had was, I know that right? Full prefrontal may not have, New York Times critical acclaim, may not have the biggest.
Why not is the question. No, I'm just kidding.
But I'm curious, right? I'm someone who would be much more discouraged, I think, than you at kind of that, lack of immediate instant gratification of people are attached to this, people are clinging to this, and it gives me that fuel to keep going. I'm a love the performing arts, so quite literally, that applause is a dopamine hit that I seek, right, when I'm on stage. But I'm curious, can you speak to that your attachment to the success for this podcast, right? How, I guess, has your attachment, or maybe lack thereof, kept you motivated to keep going when others may not have, right? I'm curious what you see as having driven you, right, forward. Is it spirituality? Is it the school direct? Is it executive function just generally? I'm curious your kind of mindset there. I'm sure there's some wisdom that others I think would really, really benefit from.
Well, I mean, such a good question, and I really wonder. I have this amazing producer, Evian Ellickson, who without her I would not be able to do anything, and I probably think that she's shocked that I have not quit and folded. So I'm wondering myself. So a couple of things that come to mind. One is I didn't start a podcast to monetize on the podcast. I'm so ill-equipped, honestly, to know how to do that anyways. So that's one thought. But the second thought is I'm so convinced that people need good information. And I have created good information, and they can consume it at their own pace. One of the nicest things about podcast is if people discover it, they can go back and listen to something. It's not one-time thing. You guys are too young to even remember the days when you went to a lecture and you heard and you're like, what? This is it? I can never hear you again ever. Antonio Damasio is one of my favorite neuroscientists who I haven't had on my podcast yet. But I was in the audience at Harvard University, 25 years ago. And I went and said hello to him, again, just as a thing that I do. But what I was just thinking that he's never going to remember me. I don't even remember exactly what he said, but it was so profound. I remember it being profound, but I have no ways to know what the heck it was, right? So I feel like the podcast platform or this kind of recording is something that people can revisit, or something. Second thing is somebody can re-listen and learn again. So I feel optimistic about that. But more importantly, you bring up spirituality, and this is such an important aspect of my personal growth in the last 14 years. You both know that I'm an ardent student of Bhagavad Gita, which is it's a deep philosophical, spiritual guidebook for every Hindu. And one of the things I'm learning about that is something called karma yoga, which is you take actions with great fidelity, commitment, and resolve, so that you are committed to the best results. However, the results is not what your action determines. Results may or may not be favorable. And so that principle has really spoken to my heart. So I feel creating a podcast is my goal, having phenomenal team who encourages me and allows me to do this. And again, I'm so grateful to my guests. They agree. I have no idea why they agree. So they are there. But then I also know that success, there's so much chatter all around us, and what speaks to people. It's a very nerdy podcast. There's a lot of information. It's about change. It's not entertainment. It's not juicy like gossip. So I understand I'm competing with that space, but my purpose and intention is different. So I'm okay that it will speak to few. In spite of that, we have crossed 1 million listenership. We are being heard in 110 countries or more. And so those kinds of things give me joy. But we were such dummies. We didn't even track listenership until I became aware that, you can track listenership. I didn't know. So anyway, that's where the production level is. We are very mom and pop joint, with amazing quality, but not great performative aspect to it. And I'm okay with it because this is not I'm investing money here, but I'm not getting any returns because that's not the goal. This is a resource. I want teachers, educators, parents, psychologists, social workers, everybody to have access to some understanding about executive function, and speech pathologists, of course.
And you're doing work that is really, I think, pushing the boundaries in a lot of good ways. Like even in my own education in the program I'm in, we're learning a lot about executive function and its role and how to assess for it. And it just becomes more and more clear to me how executive function is so necessary for every function. And the patients that we see in the clinic that I work in, they may be having challenges with anxiety, with depression, other things, but all the time there's something up with executive function. And I'm like, wow, she was speaking the gospel all along. So I think that really is a resource, Mom. And you're chasing your passion, which we've seen since we were kids, how much you value and love your work. And it makes me think, what advice do you have for your listeners who you inspire every day, to other people, of how can they, chase the passion that you did and build something like this podcast that can serve as a resource for others? Like, what does that look like to do in a context of having a business, having a family, having life responsibilities, but still you persist? What does that look like? How can you inspire others for that?
Kunal, you captured my the essence of my kind of what ticks me. In the beginning, you said curiosity. I have deep, deep curiosity, and I think that curiosity translates into great interest in people and things. There's you both know that I'm a big fan of contemporary arts. Arts in general speaks to my heart. Arts is one of the ways we express our intelligence, but also create something that will tease other people's intellectual, desires. And On Kawara is one of my favorite contemporary artists. I think I've talked to you both about that. And Rahil, we went to Venice Biennale and we saw his work. One of the things that he talks about, so I'm interested in passage of time. And if you look at life, it's all about passage of time, journey through passage of time. You can be aware of passage of time or you can be unaware of time, but time doesn't stop. And I'm his work really captured all the things that I have thought about. So, for example, he published one of his art pieces called 12 Years. So he mailed postcards where I am. And for 12 years, he mailed postcards. 12 years. Show me one thing that even brushing your teeth, like there may be some days people may have wish. So when I started working with executive function, one of the biggest problems I saw when people had executive dysfunction is their unwillingness to create habits and to stick with them. They just didn't see any appeal and they wanted big returns for small actions. So I don't want to brush my teeth unless I have a threat of my teeth falling or my teeth are beautiful. Well, no, you don't question. It is only preventative, right? So every single thing, if you look at executive function, is about preventative aspects of you organize yourself now. So tomorrow's you will be so relieved that you don't have to start packing right before you take a flight, right? So one thing that as I think about what I want people who are listeners and people who are interested in self-optimization is, it is not about becoming proficient so you have free time. I think it's really about getting lost in the work that you do because you love it. And I do not consider, I am, you know what they say, look around and give the job to the busiest person. If I tell people the things, I most often don't talk about this, but you know this, that I serve on, I'm on two major boards. I am a founder and a president of another nonprofit. I'm, I have a sidebar of art, like I love to do. Like my brother is turning 60, and so I created some art piece, and I love to organize and plan and create some events and activities. And we are a big family that plans. So I want listeners to understand that dreaming is amazing, but you do not need to land at dreaming. You need to really live in your dreamland. And I think that is not possible without goal-directed persistence. And I think too often I'm seeing people spend too much of their time thinking about making it big. Nothing, it's like we say, like, right, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? So how do you become big is doing every small thing well. So I really like that thought process, that if you want to make an impact on the world, which should be the priority, that every single thing you do matters, and doing it well is more important than doing a lot.
Amazing. And so many like great lessons in there for listeners to kind of take away. But I mean, for me, it's the concept of patience, perseverance, goal-directed persistence, the idea that it is these incremental gains, that you should not be expecting this immediate instant gratification, but find that joy in the journey, in the process, and then over time you'll look back and say, and wow, like, how did I grow so much, right? I know we told you about this earlier. I kind of have been doing some volunteering with New York City Parks Department, going up to the Bronx Pelham Bay Park, and like pulling weeds in the forest basically. And I asked the kind of volunteers, the kind of leaders there of the projects, like, you come here every year and you do the same thing, like, is this really doing anything for the forest? And they're like, you wouldn't believe it, but of course, you pull weeds in the spot and they'll grow back, but you do this 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and this kind of one space that we're in now would have looked so different had we not been here persevering, right? And it's like, that is to me what executive function is. It's the kind of pulling the weeds in your mind, right, in the corners, recesses of your mind, to cultivate that, the garden that can then bloom, right, in your brain. So I mean, just so many great lessons, and I'm hoping kind of people take a lot of amazing stuff away from this conversation. I know we're running up on time, so I want to start, and speaking of time, I want to start thinking about the future and talking about the future. And I'm curious, right? We've kind of teased at it, but we haven't really talked about all the things that you do, and you just mentioned these boards that you're on and whatnot. But a big thing, of course, is EXQ, the company that you've started. I'm curious kind of how you see this podcast and EXQ in conversation, right? Do you at all see, as you look ahead, right, to the future, full prefrontal converging at all with EXQ? Do you see these as separate projects? I'm curious, with someone who is like you, such a polymath, so kind of involved in so many things, and so kind of, and Renaissance woman, right? Like, I'm curious kind of how you see these two big projects that you've been working on for so long coalescing down the road.
Yeah, such a great question. And I know I'm also sorry, listeners. Sorry if I'm going on and on, but thank you for that question. So EXQ is also a passion project, and it's a 100% digital platform that I have created to teach children how to learn and how to think about their thinking. And it is designed to be implemented in schools as a curriculum. We begin with an assessment of 9 areas of cognition and executive function. And based on that profile, it personalizes learning and training and skill development for every single child. So I'm on a mission that, number one, I do not believe in the framing of executive dysfunction and wait till it becomes a dysfunction, because every single person must learn how the self-management works. So when I talk about executive function, it is how I manage my goals, how I manage my emotions, how I manage my relationships, how I manage my task, time, space, and finally, how I manage the safety and security and flourishing of my future self. So we are managing these things. We are not managing tasks. So I hate when people say, I'm making my bed. No, you're managing the emotional state of you at night, who returns in bed and feels so relieved to see a beautifully made bed waiting for you, because the past self was kind, generous, and thoughtful to take care of you. So I think about that. So executive function EXQ platform is created to teach this to all children. And second is, I want to transform education. I want to create something called executive function culture, a culture where pausing, stopping, reflecting to think about self as an agent of your life and thinking about something that is intangible, such as your future. Do you know how profound it is to realize that you will never meet your future self? And every single thing you're doing is for that future self who is a stranger. And what kind of life will we be leading if we never invest that kind of time to understand the emotional, psychological, cognitive state of that future self? So that's what the EXQ platform is all about, to have this access to this specialized training that I have spent 20, 30 years doing to bring that. And the way I see podcast and EXQ, preparing, I'm a voracious reader. I read 1 or 2 books a week. One of the things that I want is, it is impossible for people to see relationship between their expertise to executive function, because they may not consider executive function. When I interviewed Franz de Waal, who is a primatologist, I mentioned Times named him as the one of the 100 influential people in the world. And he said, I don't know what executive function is. And so I did talk about future prospection in the primates that he studies, and empathy and compassion that we see in animals or primates that humans have. And so he says, oh, that's what you call executive function. So you see what I mean? So people may be doing the work without calling the labels. But when we think about teaching children, I want these elements of training that need to be seeping in. You can't tell a child to be kind, because you know what they do? They're kind to their kind of people. So true kindness is to be kind to everybody, particularly when they're not like you. So EXQ is designed with that thought in mind. And this podcast is a resource for every person who will be using EXQ to teach executive function in their classroom.
Yeah. I mean, you can just, I don't know if the listeners of the podcast can, but we can just feel and see kind of like your enthusiasm and deep love for this project. It's so clear how much you want to touch people's lives and change education, I think, in a really fascinating way that shows that this executive function, which I think when we were kids, like maybe 15, 20 years ago, meant very little to very little people. And now it means everything. And I think that's so important. I think I love the question Kunal asked also, because the podcast brings an awareness to the public that I think EXQ is trying to sort of actualize on. Podcast gives the information, and EXQ is like, well, here's how it's done. And I think that's really cool. And I hope that the listeners of the podcast can take that and roll with it and see how they've applied it to their own lives, because you can only grow so much from learning about executive function. And I think that leads us to our last question, which is just your hopes for the future. What's next with these next 200 episodes and more or less. I don't know. It's completely up to you. I think the question that you always ask your guests, so we thought it would be fun to ask you, is what are your influences? What are you reading? What's going to shape you going forward? And maybe even teasing some future guests that you have in mind. So what's
great questions. Listen, have you considered starting a podcast, both of you? No, I'm just kidding.
We would have never shot at you like that.
Well, a couple of things. It's so interesting. I started my podcast in 2017. So here we are, 200th episode. And believe it or not, people have moved on, and people have achieved next year's tier of their own achievements. So I am doing round 2 with many of my guests whom I interviewed for their previous book, who are coming back with their new book. So Nobody's Fool is a book that just came out. It's coming out in a couple of weeks with neuroscientist Christopher Chabris and Dan Simons, who came on my podcast earlier for their Invisible Gorilla book. So that, so I'm going to have Hal Hirschfield, who is my hero in Future Self, who published a book. I interviewed him, and I had been following his research for the last 15 years, but I interviewed him when he had not written a book. So I'm going to have him back. So one example I want to give is, one of the directions that I want to take is really interesting people having very influential role to play in the way we think about life. So take example of, Greg Bear and Ryan Rudisky came on my podcast. They have written a book called When You Wonder You're Learning. It was Mr. Rogers' enduring lessons for raising creative, curious, and caring kids. So I see a great potential of bringing people who have done given a thought about people who have managed to improve executive function, but they are not scientists. And they were not even Mr. Rogers. To me, I don't even know how to describe him. He's everything that every teacher needs to become. So I see the future in that way. And as I answer your last question in closing, what am I reading? So I've been preparing a lot about how people change their mind. So two authors I'm reading right now is Adam Grant and his book, Think Again, and David McCraney's book, which is How Minds Change. So because I believe executive function means stopping to self-reflect, and during your self-reflection, you discover what you are not. And then developing emotional bandwidth to accept you're not all that you thought, and then taking steps to consult experts. So the biggest mistake I see, or a lost opportunity, people never milk the opportunity, is they don't want to pause to think who they are not, because it's very painful. But they also are so busy claiming to be all that they never seek experts' help. So I'm very interested in seeing what's the psychological and emotional and cognitive mechanisms that make people not think again. And the two other books I'm reading, as you know, I read a lot, is Dancing with Life. It's Philip Moffitt. I am on a spiritual path. And one of the things, this book is about Four Noble Truths and really understanding relationship to suffering. So I am deeply committed to understanding myself as a person, as I handle my disappointments, annoyances of other people, or just hardship. I'm not all for success, but I'm quite quick to get disappointed if after hard work didn't pay off. So I have a little attitude. So I'm working on that. And the last thing is, of course, Matthew Desmond's book, Poverty by America. And so I'm really committed to equity. I never thought I would be a person who has anything to offer to life's solutions. I thought I have a lane. I'm a therapist. I work with people when they have trouble. Maybe I help people in education, but I never thought I have any say in the matters of policy and changing destiny for people. And I have come to understand that until and unless I develop my deep knowledge and understand barriers that poverty creates, I cannot really change anything. So that's what I'm doing.
Well, I mean, I think, Mom, what a treat. I know you can always call us and we'll have a, begrudging pick up the phone and say how our day was. But this is, something I want to do every week if I could, right? Just kind of get to really hear from you, about your journey and where you were, where you're heading, where you were coming from, and where you're heading to, right? It's just really just been amazing to kind of hear it from your voice. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And thank you, Kunal. Thank you, Rahil, for being incredible children, incredible partners in this journey. Looking at you two both and getting a chance to talk to you gives me such a great sense of joy because you came with your independent mindset and you came with your incredible warmth as well as brilliance, and your humility and kindness is really something I deeply admire. And I, of course, see a huge thumbprint of your dad on both of you. So I'm grateful to have my young self, my current self thanks my young self to have a wisdom to find a partner and who was so aligned in so many ways. And to see those qualities in you gives me great joy. It was hardly any work to raise you because you came wired to listen. So I deeply appreciate that. All right, listeners, that's all the time we have for today. As you can see, these are important conversations. thank you for hanging out with me for 200 episodes. It's an incredible journey, and I could not do this without you. I personally thank each and every one of you for being a listener and your generosity of time. I know you have so many choices, but hanging out with us at Full Prefrontal is means a lot. And lastly, I do want to thank Evian Ellickson, our incredible esteemed producer. Without her, I would be nothing. So once again, thank you, and stay tuned until we come back again next time on Full Prefrontal.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full Prefrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.